Am I making you uncomfortable? I'm making myself a little uncomfortable. My computer has different effects, and this is Space Alien. Take me to your leader. Oh wait, Kruger is your leader. I have found him. Anyway, yeah, kid is sick. Amy took him to the doctor yesterday, and he is ill. So I'm home today, and it also works out okay because I'm getting sick too. Our little circle of disease is coming full circle. Anyway, if you could open up to page 40, Joe Starks is building up Eatonville, and he's making a lot of money very, very quickly. One little thing to notice on page 40 is an expression that Joe uses, which I think really kind of gives us a good insight into who he is as a character. If we look about halfway down the page, when Joe is mentioning that he should bring a store to the town, one of the other townspeople said, "That would be nice, Brother Stark, since you mentioned it." "I God, of course it would." "I God" is an interesting expression, because it's one that I don't know that I've ever heard anyone else say. Typically, someone would say, "My God." Saying "I God" is a very different take on that expression, because it puts a lot more emphasis and importance on oneself. And I think that's why you never hear anyone else use that expression. And Joe and Joe/Jody use that expression quite a bit. In terms of Joe/Jody, Janie calls Joe Jody when she's feeling positively about him. When she's not feeling so positively about him, she either calls him Joe or doesn't really refer to him at all. Go for it a little bit. So he puts up a store and he puts up a post office, and he buys a bunch of land and starts to sell off plots of land to people. So he has a lot of money to begin with, but his investments pay off handily, and he ends up making really, really a lot of money. As the town gets a little bit more advanced and things continue to progress, take a look at page 43. At one of the town meetings, the town votes Joe in as mayor on 43, and everyone is cheering and applauding, and one character asks for a speech from Mrs. Mayor Starks. The burst of applause was cut short by Joe taking the floor himself. "Thank you very much for your compliments, but my wife don't know nothing about no speech making. I never married her for nothing like that. She's a woman, and her place is in the home." Janie made a face laugh after a short pause, but it wasn't too easy. She'd never thought about making a speech, and she didn't know if she cared to make one at all. It must have been the way Joe spoke out without giving her a chance to say things one way or another that took the bloom off of things. Anyway, she went down the road behind him that night feeling cold. And when we get to that section in the movie, I think that the expression on Janie's face, and then they cut in the crowd to the expression on Phoebe's face, and those two are kind of making eye contact with each other, really shows how badly Janie felt. She tried to play it off because she didn't want to create a scene in front of the whole town, especially at such a big moment for her husband. But on the other hand, it made her feel pretty lousy, because it shows that he is much more focused on himself than he is on her. Going forward a little bit, Joe also proposed that they purchase a street lamp, which was one of your quiz questions today. And as he's putting it up, they make a big deal about it. You know, he really kind of he puts it in a display case and really makes a big deal about it, and invites the whole town over to see it. And they turn it on, and then the town is really pretty happy with Joe at this point. Things are going well. And at this point, he also really hasn't started to throw his weight around. And the more money he ends up making, the more he throws his weight around. After they leave that event on page 46, Joe and Janie head back to their house. When it was over that night in bed, Jody asked Janie, "Well, honey, how do you like being Mrs. Mayor?" First of all, the fact that Joe is referring to her as Mrs. Mayor and not Mrs. Joe Starks, or Mrs. Starks, or Mrs. Janie Starks, but Mrs. Mayor. She's not married to Joe Starks anymore. She's married to the mayor. I think that's pretty significant, because that's really not what Janie wants. Janie doesn't have Joe's desire for power that he does. It's all right, I reckon, but don't you think it keeps us in a kind of strain? Strain, you mean the cooking and waiting on folks? Not Jody, it just looks like us in some way we ain't natural with one another. You's always off talking and fixing things, and I feel like I'm just marking time. Hope it gets over soon. Over? Janie? I ain't even started good. I told you at the very beginning that I aim to be a big voice. You ought to be glad, because that makes a big woman out of you. A feeling of coldness and fear took hold of her. She felt far away from things and lonely. Things are continuing to progressively get worse. And in the previous quote that I gave you, when she had mentioned that it took the bloom off of things, that's kind of definitely a reference back to the pear tree and her initial vision of what marriage should be and how it should be loving and caring and passionate and all of those things. As Joe continues to gain power, the rest of the town starts to resent it a little bit because he treats people fairly viciously. On page 47, there was something about Joe Starks that cowed the town. It was not because of physical fear. He was no fist fighter. His bulk was not even posing as men go. Neither was it because he was more literate than us. Something else made men give way before him. He had a bow-down command in his face, and every step he took made the thing more tangible. And the bow-down command thing has to do with money. The more money he has, the more power he has. Because, in comparison to the other people who live in the town, and their lives are definitely made better by Joe Starks, as we're going to see in an argument coming up here fairly soon, and yet his life is much better after having moved there and investing in the town, and he's made a lot of money off the people who live there. Take, for instance, this new house of his. It had 2 stories with porches and banisters and such things. The rest of the town looked like servants' quarters surrounding the big house. And different from everybody else in the town, he put off moving in until it was painted in and out. And look at the way he painted it, a glowy, sparkly white, the kind of promenading white that the houses of Bishop Whipple, W.B. Jackson, and the Vanderpools wore. It made the village feel funny talking to him, just like he was anybody else. It's pretty significant that he sets up the town and the house that he chooses to build, and it makes it look like the plantation house. And in comparison to that big, gigantic white house, the other houses in the town look like small shacks. Slave quarters surrounding the big house. There's also a lot of little details, like the spittoon he buys. He buys a golden spittoon. And for those of you who don't know what a spittoon is, it's disgusting. But when one chews tobacco, which also is disgusting, one needs to spit tobacco juice. And rather than do it on the floor, which is disgusting, they choose to do something which is even more disgusting. They choose to spit it into a big bucket so that it can just sit there and fester all day. And then they dump their big spit bucket out at the end of the day. Anyway, then he spit into that gold-looking vase that anybody else would have been glad to put on their front room table. Said it was a spittoon just like his used-to-be boss man used to have up at the bank there in Atlanta. If you remember back to the beginning, he said he'd been working for the white folks all his life. And you can see that he's starting to treat the other people in the town the way he had been treated, working for his previous bosses. Going on a little bit, people in the town also complain about the way he treats the other townspeople. So on page 48, like one day after he caught Henry Pitts with a wagon load of ribbon cane and took the cane away from Pitts and made him leave town. Some thought Starks ought not to have done that. He had so much cane and everything else, but they didn't say that while Joe Starks was on the porch. When the mail came from Maitland, he went out inside to sort it out. Everybody had their say. So as soon as he leaves, everyone starts talking. And if you remember back to when we kind of started the book, and I talked about the way I wrote my paper was about economics and the power that it brings. And also how the book is kind of a political warning to Phoebe about her husband. If you notice that the person who strongly stands up and defends Joe is Phoebe's husband, Phoebe's husband, Sam. It's never mentioned in this section, I don't think anyway, that Sam and Phoebe are husband and wife, but he is Sam Watson and that's the husband. And as one of the town, Sim Jones, who is just kind of a random townsperson, says, it's a sin and a shame running that poor man away from here like that. Colored folks oughtn't be so hard on one another. And Sam steps up and defends Joe. I don't see it that way at all, Sam Watson said shortly. Let colored folks learn to work for what they get, like everybody else. Nobody ain't stopped Pitts from planting the cane he wanted to. Starks give him a job, what more the man want? I know that too, Jones said. But Sam, Joe Starks is too exact with folks. All he made it off the rest of us. He didn't have all that when he come here. Yeah, but none of all this you see and you's sitting on wasn't here neither when he come. Give the devil his due. But now, Sam, you know that all he do is big belly round and tell folks what to do. He loves obedience out of everybody under the sound of his voice. You can feel a switch in his hand when he's talking to you, Oscar Scott complained. That chastising feeling he sort of totes up, gives you sort of protolapsus out of cutting every line in. He's a whirlwind among breezes, Jeff Bruce blew in. Speaking of winds, he's the winds and weeds the grass. We bend whichever way he blows, Sam Watson agrees. But at that, us needs him. The town wouldn't be nothing if it wasn't for him. He can't help it being sort of bossy. Some folks need thrones and brewing chairs and crowns to make their influence felt. He don't. He got a throne in the seat of his pants. So I think the fact that he's standing up and defending Joe and Joe's behavior And you've already started to see the way that Joe is starting to treat Janie the more money he makes. In the beginning, that first little scene between Joe and Janie where they're talking, the first reference we have to Sam is kind of just a goofy, fun guy. And Janie seems to like him. But in this scene, we start to see a different side of Sam. I guess this is really the first time we've seen Sam, so this is the only time we've seen of Sam. But that maybe he would be treating Phoebe much more like Joe was treating Janie if he had more money. And so it's not out of good morals or good, just good-heartedness that he treats her well, but because he doesn't have the financial ability to treat her more poorly, the way Joe treats Janie. Going on a little bit, then we get into this Matt Bonner stuff. So if you remember back to Nanny's little speech at the beginning where she said black women were the mule of the world, we start to see a strong connection here. Okay, and as mules effectively come from a mixed background, a horse and a donkey, along the same lines as Janie, coming from the mixed background of the white teacher who raped her and her black mother, we start to see a strong comparison between Janie and the mule. And Matt Bonner treats the mule pretty badly. People like to make fun of Matt Bonner about how badly he treats the mule. He works the mule too hard, he doesn't feed the mule enough. And my guess is some of you in the class have a friend that you like to give a hard time to. You like to make fun of them, you like to just kind of push their buttons because they get so angry. And the more angry they get, the more fun it is to make fun of them. And that's the way it is with Matt Bonner. And in addition to that, what also makes the town laugh is when Matt Bonner gets really angry, he stutters. So partially, I think all the mockery of Matt Bonner's mule is to just make Matt Bonner mad, and it's fun to kind of get his goat like that. But also, if mules are symbolic of the women in the novel, these dudes, like Hicks and Coker, who didn't have enough money to get a woman like Janie, can make fun of Matt Bonner, who his kind of woman in the text is essentially the mule. They're making fun of someone who has less money than they do, showing their kind of economic superiority. And going on a little bit, on page 55, we'll come back to the mule in a minute. This is a very strange scene because I don't know exactly how offensive it would be to have someone, another person, touch the hair of a woman. But one night, Joe had caught Walter standing behind Janie and brushing the back of his hand back and forth across the loose end of her braid ever so lightly so as to enjoy the feel of it without Janie knowing what he was doing. So Janie's got this long rope of a braid hanging down the back of her neck, and this dude kind of comes up, thinking no one else had seen, and goes like this, and just kind of touches the bottom of her braid, which is sketchy. I'm not, don't get me wrong, like, if I saw someone doing that to my wife, I would be probably upset by that, but, Joe was at the back of the store and Walter didn't see him. He felt like rushing forth with a meat knife and chopping off the offending hand. I don't know that I'd go that far. I'm fairly confident I wouldn't go that far. I think it would create a worse situation than saying, maybe stop touching my wife's hair, you creep. But he wanted to cut his hand off. That night, he ordered Jane to tie up her hair around the store. That was all. She was in the store for him to look at, not those others, but he never said things like that. It just wasn't in him. Take the matter of the Yale Mule, for instance. There's a lot of instances where Joe doesn't say what Joe thinks. If Joe had said to Janie, look, I want you to kind of tie your hair up with a hair ribbon, I forget what the thing's called, but bandana, effectively. Tie up your hair, because I saw this sketchy dude touching the bottom of your braid in the store. My guess is she would have agreed with that and not wanted sketchy dudes touching the bottom of her braid. But he was incapable of saying that. And so he just said, tie up your hair. I don't want to see your hair in the store. And because of that, Jane doesn't understand what he's doing and just thinks he's being really controlling. That little paragraph that I just read to you was kind of that interesting, in the beginning of the book I'd mentioned that sometimes the narrator is a really interesting one. And sometimes it's kind of just omniscient third person. Sometimes it kind of slides into the heads of different characters so you can hear what they're thinking. We don't really get much of Joe's opinions on things or kind of what's going on an interior level in his head because he's not one of the main... I mean, he's the main character, but we don't really get into his head without this kind of narrative technique. And my computer is going to shut down very shortly. But I'm going to try to get through this before the battery on my computer dies. On page 56, go forward a little bit, one thing they also like to do is baiting the mule. the mule comes around and people go and poke it and punch at it and do things, so it keeps spinning around and get angrier and angrier and angrier and angrier. As they're doing this, Janie gets really angry. She snatched her head away from the spectacle and began muttering to herself. They ought to be ashamed of themselves, teasing that poor brute like they is. Done been worked to death, done had his disposition ruined with mistreatment, and now they got to finish deviling him to death. I wish I had my way with them all. Joe overhears this, okay, because Janie, at this point, up to this point, hasn't really spoken out against her husband at all. And so once Janie goes, he orders Janie to go into the store to get him something, and when he does, he buys the mule from Matt Bonner. Now, just a little bit of a perspective. Joe came into town with $300. He buys the mule for $5, and Matt Bonner freaks out. He says, "I beat you trading. I got the better of you right now." So, I mean, really, the only thing it tells us is really just how much money Joe had. To be able to buy a mule for $5 and have the dude be super excited that this mule was not worth $5 at all really just kind of lets you know how much money he really did have coming into town. Once Janie hears about this, on page 58, Janie stood still while they all made comments. When it was all done, she stood in front of Joe and said, "Jody, that was a mighty fine thing for you to do. 'Tain't everybody would have thought of it, 'cause it ain't no everyday thought. Freeing that mule makes a mighty big man out of you. Something like George Washington and Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, he had the whole United States to rule, so he freed the Negroes. You got a town to free. You got a town, so you freed a mule. You got to have power to free things, and that makes you like a king or something." Hambo said, "Your wife's a born orator, Starks. Us never know that before. She put just the right words to our thoughts." Joe bit down hard on his cigar and beamed, but he never said a word. So this relates to several things. One, that's a fairly profound statement from Janie. It was, very well put, and the rest of the town realized that. And if you remember back to the scene where Joe wouldn't let Janie make a speech because he said, "I didn't marry my wife for no speech making. I didn't marry her for nothing like that." Joe doesn't say anything in response to what the dude said to him. He just bites down hard in his cigar and smiles. Okay, so for 3 days, then the town really celebrates Joe, and everyone's pretty happy about it. And then the mule dies. And in your reading for tomorrow, page 60 to 80, the mule funeral scene that they're going to have is one of the stranger scenes in the book. And we'll kind of talk about that as we come back to class on Monday. So that's all I got today. Now I must go back to my home planet. And by home planet, I mean downstairs. In my house. And by house, I mean spaceship. Have a good weekend. Bye.